Morena koutou. Thank you, Stu. So look, I just wanted to start off by saying, first of all, thanks to Zespri and KVH for the invitation to come along and speak. And just to let you all know what a fabulous job that they do on behalf of you all in terms of engaging with MPI and Biosecurity New Zealand around biosecurity matters. We work with an awful lot of industries, and your guys are as good as any, working with us in a collaborative way and working with us as partners. So you are blessed to have them. So thank you both. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Biosecurity New Zealand, how we fit into MPI, about this thing called the biosecurity system. And I'll tell you a little bit about my part of the biosecurity system, which is Readiness and Response Services, and a little bit about COVID-19 and some of the impacts that that's had on the biosecurity system, and some of the lessons that we can all take away from COVID-19, which is, after all, a biosecurity response. I work for Biosecurity New Zealand, which is part of MPI, and I always like to describe the difference as MPI is the Ministry for Primary Industries. So MPI supports, looks after, engages with, regulates the primary industries. I work for biosecurity for all of New Zealand. So we're very, very interested, of course, in working with, supporting and regulating primary industries with regards to biosecurity, but there's this other thing that we're also very focused on, not just the productive economy, but we're also very much interested in our environmental issues, and that's a big part of what we do, and you'll see a bit more of that. And I guess it's a change of focus that MPI has been having over the last couple of years, where within Biosecurity New Zealand, we have traditionally cared immensely and continue to do so about biosecurity matters that affect the productive sector, but we haven't been so focused on and as effective as dealing with biosecurity matters that affect the environment, and we've got quite a big push and change of direction and refocusing and rebalancing in that area at the moment. So we have a role in mitigating the risk of harmful organisms into New Zealand. That's fundamentally what we do. We have what we call a system leadership role. So we talk a lot about the biosecurity system, and that's what people in Wellington do. We talk a lot about systems. We talk about the criminal justice system. We talk about the legal system. We talk about the welfare system. We talk about the biosecurity system. And what we mean by system is there's a whole bunch of connected activities relating to a particular set of problems that we're trying to deal with in government. So that's what system leadership means. It means that we have a role, and it's set out in the Biosecurity Act, to provide leadership to all of the organisations, people involved in attempting to protect New Zealand from unwanted pests and diseases. We do that through regulation, compliance and accountability, so we're government, right? Regulation is one of the big levers that government has to pull. But most critically, we also do that by attempting to enable others to play their part. And so it's partnership and collaboration. And for me, that's the most important thing actually that we have to do. So it's all very well to compel people to do things through regulation, but when you can partner and you can agree on objectives and you can reach those objectives in a collaborative manner, that's always a much more powerful way to get to where you want to get to, right? I got this slide here, which is not a brilliant slide, and you probably can't really read any of it at all, but so I'll describe it to you. It's a way of looking at the biosecurity system. So this is a way of looking at the biosecurity system as a series of nets, right? And at one end of the net, you've got risk coming in, those big red dots, that's a risk coming into the net. And you can see there's a multiple series of nets, and as that risk goes through those nets, there becomes fewer risk elements, and they become smaller. And so that's what we're trying to do in the biosecurity system, is have in place layers of activity that gradually mitigate and reduce risk. And we like to say that we are a net or a series of nets, not a wall. And the not a wall is really important because I'm sure all of you have watched Dog Squad and Border Patrol, and many people think that the biosecurity system is the border. The border is only a really small part of the biosecurity system, and somehow we've allowed people to think that biosecurity is the border, and if only the border worked properly, we wouldn't have biosecurity risk. And that's not the case. If that was the case, we would have no trade and we'd have no travellers coming to New Zealand. Well, we have none at the moment. But hopefully that's a temporary aberration, right? So if you wanted to completely eliminate risk at the border, you lock New Zealand down in a much harder way than we're currently locked down, and that's pretty unpleasant for all of us. So you have to have a whole lot of other interventions, and that's what those series of nets are. We used to say we had three main levels: post-border, pre-border, and border. And then we figured out, well, that's just getting everybody to focus on the border once again. So now we're calling them offshore, border, and domestic, or within New Zealand. And so that's three main levels, and there's a whole lot of activity that operates in each of those places. And in some ways, pre-border is the most important place for us to be acting. So that's where we manage risk offshore. So before, so that's the best place to keep it, right? If we can keep the risk in the country of origin, then we're doing a pretty good job. It's also the place where our cost of intervention is lowest. So it's a pretty good place to invest. We get much more bang for our bucks when we invest in offshore. So what are we doing offshore? Lots and lots of things. So critically, we are negotiating trade agreements with trading partners. And every trade agreement we negotiate has lots and lots of parts to it. But the really important part for us is that we're negotiating biosecurity clauses into those trade agreements that set the general rules for how we're going to trade with country X and how country X is going to trade with us, and we're going to keep each other safe from unwanted pests and diseases. Then we set these things called import health standards. And so import health standards are the really specific rules that we have around a particular tradable commodity. So when we import pork into the country, we'll have an import health standard around pork that sets out the specific standards under which pork can come into the country. And we have hundreds of these import health standards that set really specific rules. So you can see how those two things alone are absolutely critical to keeping that risk offshore. And then we do a whole lot of stuff offshore as well. So like our trading partners do, I don't know if you've ever had Chinese authorities or from other countries come and look through your orchard to understand how we're managing on orchard biosecurity risk. But when we had our borders open, we were forever hosting and taking trading partners around our country for casual inspections and formal inspections of the way our primary industries are operating to manage biosecurity risk. And we do the same in their countries. So that border stuff is really important. And then we have the border itself, so the thing that people focus on. Our border operation is really slick, really sharp. People see the quarantine officers and they see the dogs, but there's so much more than that about the way we run the border. So we apply a lot of intelligence to border operations. So we are looking at every consignment, every person coming into the country and trying to understand what the biosecurity risk of that person and that consignment or that flight and that consignment, that ship might be. And we will be applying, let's call it inspection, at various rates depending on what that risk is. And we have whole teams of people that are doing that. Post-border, which is the bit where I operate, it's the most expensive part of the system to run in lots of ways, okay? So we're doing two broad sets of things. We're running diagnostic and surveillance services. So I see my former colleague Brendan Gould from the forest industry here. So Brendan used to be part of our diagnostic and surveillance services team. So what that team does is that they're running surveillance programs around the country, looking for things that have got out the end of this last net, okay? So targeted surveillance programs, general for specific pests and diseases, general surveillance programs for things that might just pop up, and they are also helping to encourage what we call passive surveillance, and that's the role that all you guys have to do. So this is not sets of experts going out to look for specific bugs or diseases, inspecting traps, etc. This is encouraging industries and all New Zealanders to understand what biosecurity risk is, and to look for pests and diseases, and then to report those pests and diseases. Passive's a strange name for it, but that's what we call it. Then we have my end, which is the last end, which is readiness and response. So I have a team led by Ange Brownie over here, who run our readiness activity. So that's how we prepare for biosecurity responses, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I have a response team, so these are the people that stand up when we have an incursion and try to do something about it. And then I run pest management, and I'll talk some more about that shortly. So that's the biosecurity system, described as a series of nets. Yeah. I thought it'd be quite good just to play that out for you, how it relates to something that you are all interested in, and that's fruit fly, right? With the kiwi fruit and other horticultural industries, we invest heavily in managing the risk of Queensland fruit fly and, Stu, how many others? Yeah. Yeah, on the list is half a dozen specific fruit flies that we specifically worked to keep out of New Zealand that present the biggest risk out of all the fruit fly species out there. And so you can see pre-border, border, surveillance, incursion, readiness and response. So we're doing something at each of those layers with fruit fly, generally in collaboration with your industry and other horticultural industries. So bilateral arrangements with trading partners. So we will not we cannot import fruit fly host commodities from any country with which we don't have bilateral arrangements, okay? So unless we've agreed some form of bilateral arrangement that sets broad rules, no matter how good the fruit and vegetables are, they can't come from a country if we don't have those arrangements in place. And then we have some quite specific import health standards that set out the way we fumigate, what fumigants we might use, etc., to provide control. At the border, passenger pathway profiling. Take cruise ships, for instance. We'll look very hard at where a cruise ship might come from, what the profile of the passengers on that cruise ship might be, and we might vary our intervention depending on our assessment of the fruit fly host risk in relation to that particular vessel. At the bottom there, specialised training for our quarantine officers around fruit fly, so they get specialised training in identifying fruit fly, and specialised training for our dogs, so we teach them how to sniff for fruit flies specifically. Surveillance and incursion, so we have a very effective surveillance program for fruit fly. So we have, started in September. So September is the commencement of the fruit fly surveillance season. So we have a surveillance network, traps, around risk areas of the country. So you get a sense of how that system works with regard to fruit fly. I'll talk to you very briefly about readiness and response services, which is my part. So readiness, so that's how we prepare for fruit fly incursion. So Ange's team works very closely as part of the Fruit Fly Council, running readiness programs for Queensland and other fruit flies. So they're looking at things like how do we improve that surveillance system, how do we improve the technical standard that we've got for fruit fly, what are the control measures we've got, how can we improve the control measures. That's fruit fly, and they do that across a whole range of threats. Response, so I think you've probably all seen how we roll out responses, so I won't go into that. Compensation is a really important part of my team, so that's how we look after, one of the ways we look after what I sometimes call the victims of a response. So, if we had a response on your orchard and we had to remove your fruit, destroy your plants under orders, then you're entitled to compensation for that. And that's a really important right that people have. And my team run the compensation program. That's a really hard piece of work. Pest management, so things don't always go well. We do have incursions, and I have a team that runs some national pest management programs. So kauri dieback, wilding conifers, wallaby control program, Undaria, Sabella, so marine organisms, a whole bunch of them. And when you get to that end of the system, things get really expensive. Okay. Just a couple of really quick things on what we're trying to do with what we call our response operating model, which is the way we run responses. We're looking to strengthen and improve the way that we make decisions. So we've been doing responses in much the same way for quite a long time. We're of the view that we need to improve the way that we do it. And for me, it is all about the way we make decisions. And the critical decisions are when we enter a response. So what do we think about when we decide we're going to do something specific about this unwanted pest or disease, which might be an attempt to eradicate it. And then the other big decision we have to make is when we're going to end the response. So we haven't achieved our objectives, or we have achieved our objectives, and then what do we do next? And we've typically looked at those things mostly with an economic and frequently with the primary industry lens. I'm pushing our team really hard to bring a wider range of lenses to that decision making. So that's what I was referring to earlier. So what's our environmental lens? What's our Ao Māori lens? What's our social lens? What's our cultural lens? And how do we understand all of those things? I typically, when we have a new unwanted pest or disease notified, I get a thing called a risk assessment, and this tells me how much risk there is. And it's a science-based thing, right? And it tells me that with relation to the primary industries, it could affect this type of thing, it could affect this type of tree, it could affect this type of animal. And I go, okay, have we thought about how it might affect taonga species, how it might affect native species? Oh no, we can't do that because there is no literature on that. So that's kind of not good enough, is it? So we have to find new ways to make risk assessments. So that's one of the things we're doing in that decision-making space. We need to be much more people-centric. So typically when we run responses, we get really excited about the disease, which we should do, and we hunt the disease down. But we are not always as conscious, and certainly not early enough, about what's the impact on the people and the businesses that are affected by us doing that. And so that's a thing that we're trying to work really hard at. We're wanting to be treaty anchored. So we have this fantastic thing called the Grower Industry Agreement for Readiness and Response, GIA, which means that we have a formal mechanism for partnering with primary industries that enter GIA arrangements with us. And it's great, it works really well. It's sometimes quite challenging, as it should be, but it works really well. We have no formal arrangement for partnering with our treaty partner on biosecurity responses. And again, for me, that's just not good enough, and we have to find a way to do that. And lastly, we have this thing called networked model, which goes back to that first slide. So it's about the way we do our business, right? So we can regulate, government's good at regulating, and we can enforce compliance, and sometimes we're good at enforcing compliance. But the best way to get where you want to is through partnership and collaboration, and so that's what this network model is. And again, it's sort of part of the culture change that we're seeking to achieve, both in my part of Biosecurity New Zealand and across the organisation. Have you got time to talk about this? No, okay. You can ask me questions about COVID-19 if you'd like.
Yeah, we can do it.
Excellent.
So, questions from the floor.
With the changes at the border, are there any plans to sneak in potentially increased biosecurity responses or control factors with the changes that we're going to be experiencing with going forward?
Yeah, so we don't sneak things in. But if the question is, does the COVID-19 biosecurity response, which has effectively closed down the passenger pathway part of the border, but the cargo pathway is still very much up and running, does that mean that we might do something different when we reopen the border? Yes, it probably does. I can't be specific with you, but it certainly is giving us quite a lot of pause, room to breathe, and to think about how we run border operations. What's the greater role that technology might play at the border, for instance? There is quite a lot of talk going on at government, senior government levels about how border agencies collaborate more effectively and whether or not you should have one single border agency. And so I couldn't possibly express a view on that. But there is talk around that, and I guess the thing that COVID has done, it is a biosecurity response, and I think it has created an awareness that public health hasn't played as prominent a feature at the border as it might have done. And so there'll certainly be some thinking and some changes around that, I believe. So whether or not you see, at the moment you have immigration, customs, biosecurity uniforms at the border. Whether you see another set of uniforms at the border, I don't know, but something will change, I'm pretty sure.
All of the sessions that we've had this morning are really good prompts and reminders for us around the efforts that we have around biosecurity and the concept of raising everybody's awareness about that. And I thought it was probably a good time that we could reflect back to a year ago when we were involved in the initiation with MPI of the Ko Tātou This Is Us program, and some of the really good presentations and videos that were done around that time to just bring home the fact that all of the efforts that we do, and we focus around the kiwi fruit industry on for us, but biosecurity risk has risk for all of New Zealand, including our communities, our economy, and all of the people that are within that. So we're just going to quickly, before morning tea, because we are a little bit ahead of schedule as well, play that original Ko Tātou This Is Us video.
Dear Aotearoa, dear home, with every turn of the tide, every seam of the seasons, look around at all we have, this plentiful way of life. This place is more than a setting of my story. I was grown on its meat and milk, healed by its plants. My hands have dug kumara from its soil, my feet tuatua from the sand. This fragile place is all we've got. It's vulnerable to pests and diseases, so we must guard as if our way of life depends on it, because it does. As my last sunset creeps over the edge of our precious island, I'll be asking one thing of you. Look after it. Protect it. Aotearoa, this is us.